Well, once again, good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to have you with me. And I'd like to say that my goal this evening is to help you create your own myth for dying. And I'm very excited about what we'll get to talk about this evening. I'm also a clinical psychologist in Frederick, Maryland, and I've been practicing psychotherapy now for 50 years. I'm also, I believe, the last surviving member of the original Jung group, the forefounders of what has become the Jung Society. We gathered together in 1976 under the auspices of Ellen Kochnig. Some of you have heard of her, the first Jungian analyst in D.C. And I'd like to thank the people that are supporting the Jung Society today. Pat Carr, Pat Nordine, Jane Byerly, and especially April Barrett. I remember when we gathered, my buddy Roger Lyons, once we had decided to be a group and to coalesce around Jung, Roger threw the I Ching. And what he first threw was 45, which is gathering together. And that changed into number 8, holding together. And I think that's what we've done. With the help of everyone, we have gathered together and we're holding together. And I think that's pretty neat for 50 years that the I Ching has that kind of wisdom. Okay. I have written 2 books. One I self-published called Ars Nova, Understanding the Alchemical Mystery in the Age of Aquarius. And my second book, The Tao of Alchemy, will be released by Chiron this March 31st. So several of the ideas that I'm presenting have been articulated in my books, but also several ideas are rather new. Also, if you're interested, I have a website that supports the book, and that website is arsnovaalchemy.com. In my opinion, we are all now modern alchemists. If you're here listening to this presentation, you're a modern alchemist by my definition, because there's a reason you're here, and there is an inquisitiveness that's taking place within you. Neumann would refer to us as centroverts, and I think a year or 2 ago, someone presented a whole evening on the concept of Neumann's centroversion, but I call it modern alchemy. Because we are perhaps looking more deeply into things and trying to discern perhaps a hidden meaning in things that aren't always quite apparent at first blush. I'll also draw some ideas from my concept of modern alchemy, which involves the rejection of the judgment paradigm, the consciousness of the unconscious, or the Veredo. And I'd also emphasize the importance of creativity as an essential method for communicating with the unconscious, as well as dreams and synchronicity. The genesis for this talk came from out of a Western I was reading, where I learned that it was common among Plains Indians who believed they were mortally wounded would create their own death song. And I got to thinking, what would my death song be? And it wouldn't be a song because I can't sing, and it wouldn't be a dance because I can't dance, but it might be a myth. And that's what got me started about thinking about this lecture. And then John Martinez, in the spirit of this, brought me this amazing book, Japanese Death Poems. And it turns out that in Japanese culture that has lasted for hundreds of years, it was traditional to create a death poem at the time you believed your life was going to cease. So this is an excellent book. It's very well written, it's very approachable, and it's clear to me that the author, Joel Hoffman, worked very hard to translate accurately from Japanese script to English renderings that stay true to the spirit of the haiku. So I just wanted to mention that to you. Changing our focus a little bit, this presentation tonight will have 3 discrete sections. One will be an investigation of 3 essential ideas that I think are very helpful. The second will be a presentation of my personal myth for dying. And the third section will be a consideration of negative capability, which I will define later, but that will be the last section of my talk. So, the first section, the ideas. I was very interested in John Keats's ideas about things recently. John Keats lived in 1795, died in 1820. He was 25 years old, and he died 65 years before Carl Jung was born. And he was a poet. He died of tuberculosis. I think he acquired the TB from trying to help his brother who had tuberculosis. But he died in Rome and was buried there. So one of his ideas is that of continual allegory. And then I'd like to talk about my idea of the dynamic reciprocity of creativity. And then the last one will be negative capability. I think it's important that we not get too caught up in the rational side of things when we create our myth. For me, to paraphrase Jung, this is my myth, and it is not intended to be a definitive truth, but rather a truth that is relevant to me and perhaps to you, to the degree it fits. And as I said before, the last piece will be about negative capability and the challenge of love. One starting point for me is the rejection of the judgment paradigm. To me, when you use the judgment paradigm for relationship, it doesn't yield much. In other words, the judgment paradigm is basically, I'm right, and if you differ from me, you're wrong. If I'm good and you differ from me, you're bad. The judgment paradigm cuts like a knife. A knife is good for one thing. It separates this from that. So when you use the judgment paradigm, quite often you're separating something from something else. And people that use the judgment paradigm for relationship usually assume they're right and therefore the other person is wrong. And I've thought this through a little bit, and I think you can describe facts. 2 and 2 equals 4. That's right, that's correct. But so often people attribute the judgment paradigm to their opinions. And so tonight, I just want to present opinions. I don't want to judge or present facts as I see it. So just a little discussion about the rejection of the judgment paradigm. So if we don't use the judgment paradigm, what paradigm should we use? Because remember, judgment is separate. So what's going to allow these circles, I'm good, you're bad, I'm right, you're wrong, to cross over? We'll have to use a different paradigm, the paradigm of understanding. And when you use understanding instead of judgment, we can find a common mutual place where we can be different, but we're still contained in an environment where we can be different but not wrong or bad for being different, mutually inclusive. So how does one validate their own myth for dying? And I believe the answer to that is self-knowledge. Self-knowledge is an inner truth that, when reflected upon, is known to be self-evident. So you're really asking yourself to verify your own myth. And I think that's very possible if you listen deeply to yourself and you get that judgment paradigm out of the way. You can relate to it more readily. So the key here for me is that the validation for our own myth lies within ourselves. And I think Jason Smith is going to present February 23rd, the last of 6 lectures that he's doing on self-knowledge. So there's a lot to be said about that, but I'm just suggesting that one's self-knowledge is the validation for your myth. That is, no one else's confirmation is required to validate knowledge that you find within yourself. So often we look to others for that validation, and I'm suggesting maybe that's not such a good idea, that we can look within for that validation. Okay. So self-knowledge is the means by which you validate your own myth for dying. All right. Let's look at what Carrie Baines has to say for a starting point. She says, "The reshaping of values in the progress of today forces modern man out of a nursery world of collective traditions into an adult world of individual choice. He knows that his choice and his fate now turn upon his understanding of himself." And I'm of the opinion that collective belief, collective assumptions is breaking down in the face of individual need and individual pursuit. And so Ms. Baines is confirming that, at least with this quote, in my opinion. This idea that it's up to each one of us is the starting point for the Tao of Alchemy, my next book, and it's a very good starting point for your own personal myth. So, why? Why a myth for dying? So that begs the question, why are you here tonight? And to me, that is a very relevant question. And to answer it for myself, you must answer that for yourself. But for me, I answer it with the notion that in developing creating a myth, personal myth for dying, you are in fact burnishing your spirit. I think that we as a society don't have much of a conscious relationship to our spirit. And so when you engage in creating a myth, you are in fact, I think, enhancing your own spiritual development in that endeavor. I believe that by focusing on a myth for dying, we realize our spirit and freshen the immediacy of our life today. People don't think very often, in my opinion, of helping their spirit become bright and glowing and sustaining. And so I'm advocating a conscious relationship to your spirit. Clinically, I have encountered, unfortunately, through my career, several people for whom their spirit has been extinguished, that there's no reason to live, that life has just become too difficult, too hard. And when I've asked, why haven't you killed yourself? The answer generally is, because I'm not courageous enough, and all I do is wake up to the next day and live until I go to sleep and wake up again. And I feel that's very unfortunate for those individuals, but it happens. One of my pet peeves is the expression, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. And I'm of the opinion that there are plenty of people who didn't die, but who life has broken and crushed their spirit. So to me, it's very important to stay in touch with your spirit, nurture your spirit, and burnish your spirit for living. It's also my opinion that one's spirit requires consistent effort and intentional sustenance if it is to flourish in your life. You got to work at it. In couples therapy, frequently I'll ask one of the couples or both of them, what's the most important relationship in your life? And they'll think for a minute. And they say, well, I guess it's this, my marriage or our relationship. And I said, then why won't you work harder for that relationship, for that understanding? You need to find that mutually inclusive place between you and your partner. So, Jung had something to say about a myth for dying. According to von Franz, to a question Jung replied, it won't help you to recall on your deathbed, Jung said this or that. You must have your own myth. To have your own myth means to have suffered with a question until an answer has come to you from the depths of your soul. That does not imply that this is the definitive truth, but rather that this truth which has come is relevant for oneself as one now is, and believing in the truth helps one to feel well. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about relevant ideas in the creation of your personal myth. Jung said, "When I was very ill and had an out-of-body experience, a heart attack in 1944, a feeling of great relief came over me. It was no longer about age or youth. What counted was the unfolding of meaning. I experienced how the element of meaning took up its rightful space, which here in the material world is only dimly perceived of, hardly recognized because of so much superficiality. It had freed from the bonds of matter and existence and could therefore fully reveal itself." Jung's idea, or he experienced in his altered state, perhaps death-like, is that life is about finding meaning. So let me ask you, how might you find meaning in the creation of your own myth? I'd like to introduce 3 ideas I've found to be very helpful in the creation of my own personal myth. 2 are extensions of John Keats, and the other is the other ideas of my own thinking. Let's talk about continual allegory. This is Keats' idea. And so let's start with a definition of allegory. Allegory is an idea, a story, or a picture of one's life that can be interpreted or understood to reveal a hidden meaning. And I think the emphasis needs to be on hidden meaning. Let me ask you again. What might the hidden meaning in your life be? Now remember, no judgment. Can't do that. But what might the hidden meaning in your life be? And in my experience, sometimes I can ask a question like that and I don't get an answer. But if I stay with it and gently keep asking that question, many times something will emerge that kind of, or does, answer the question. So don't burden yourself with an immediate answer right now as to the hidden meaning of your life. But think about it. Okay. Life is best approached as a deep mystery, a mystery to participate and learn from, rather than something to be figured out and therefore solved. Now this is a very, very important quote for me in my journey. This is by Richard Wilhelm, Secret of the Golden Flower. Wilhelm says, "In Buddhism, this return to nirvana is connected with a complete extinction of the ego, which, like the world, is only illusion." Okay? But in Taoism, on the other hand, the goal is to preserve in transfigured form the idea of the person, the traces left by experience. That is the light which with life returns to itself and which is symbolized as the golden flower. I believe this quote speaks to the allegory of spirit, in that there is an idea that the person is sustained in death, in transfigured form, if I understand what Wilhelm's saying that the Taoists believe. I'll return to this idea a little later, but I wanted to introduce it to you here because of the importance of the idea of transfigured form, the idea of the person. Okay. Now, Keats had this to say about his own idea of continual allegory. A man's life of any worth is a continual allegory, and very few eyes can see the mystery of this life. I like that quote. I don't like the elitist idea of it, but I like the challenge of it. Okay. Remember, we're still exploring ideas around the idea or the issue of continual allegory. So Jung says, so it is conceivable and well within the realm of possibility that after death, individual consciousness returns to a universal consciousness. But that is the great mystery. He said, I feel quite certain, though, that the process of becoming conscious continues after death. Whoa. I don't know Jung to talk that definitively very often, to make such a categorical statement, but there's no question that in his myth for dying, he would see consciousness continuing after death in some form or other. I'll come back to that idea a little later, but I'd like just to put it out there for you. Okay. Now, my idea. It's my opinion that implicit in the term continual allegory is that a symbolic meaning runs through the entire narrative of one's life. As one's life progresses, deeper meaning can be distilled from one's experiences. And a symbolic meaning can be uncovered that yields a deep richness that extends beyond people, places, and calendar events. So our task tonight, in my opinion, is to attempt to harvest the symbolic meaning of our life as a continual allegory. I emphasize in the title, creating. I think creation is an incredibly important activity for us humans to engage in, as it revitalizes spirit and introduces mystery. So let me say this. Creativity is the means by which the consciousness of the unconscious is accessed. Creativity in the broadest sense. Regardless of how we relate to ourselves, creativity is essential to the maintenance of our spirit. And as you know, I'm very biased. Keeping and sustaining a conscious relationship to our spirit is very important in the quality of life we live. And I think it's a very good thing to engage intentionally in that sustenance. I got a little ahead of myself here. Creativity sustains one's spirit and hence imparts a mysterious meaning to the pursuit of life itself. Okay, now I'd like to introduce the idea, my idea of the dynamic reciprocity of creativity. Okay. I propose to take the idea of continual allegory a step further. It's my opinion that in some situations, a mysterious reciprocity arises between the creator and the object created. This may not always be the case, but from the perspective of life as an allegory, remember, hidden meaning, from the perspective of life as an allegory, once an object is created, a dynamic reciprocity may develop between the creator and that which is created. I will refer to this phenomenon as the dynamic reciprocity of creativity. I'm suggesting that your personal myth for dying can function as a continual allegory for you in your life. And I'm of the opinion that in creating a personal myth, a reciprocity can be established between you and your myth. This back and forth exchange and sincere interaction with your myth will form a dynamic that has the power to sustain your spirit into your own death and perhaps even beyond your death. I realize that's rather challenging to assert, but here. So Jung says, but such a belief about the continuation of life after death can have a kind of revitalizing effect or healing value, and maybe have this fantasy for precisely this reason. We cannot exclude the possibility that there are metaphysical processes that we are totally incapable of grasping. So, maybe spirit does continue after death, maybe. But metaphysical processes that we are incapable of grasping, I completely agree with. I'm proposing that what becomes created can in turn inform the creator. This dynamic reciprocity is established reflexively, without thought or intention. This reciprocity is dynamic because an exchange can occur from one to the other, from the creator to the created, from the created to the creator, each in their own way. This event, when it occurs, is part of the mystery of continual allegory, that is, its dynamic power for reciprocity. So, having said all that, now I'd like to provide you with an example of what I'm talking about dynamic reciprocity. This is obviously Da Vinci's Last Supper, a beautiful painting known by many. Here's my friend and modern alchemist, Doug Seward, and Doug has created a painting called Setting the Table. Doug and I have talked extensively about this painting, and we have it here in the room. So Doug got to thinking about what would it be like before all the apostles and Jesus came to supper. I think that's a great thought. So he painted a painting that somebody had to set the table, somebody had to provide for Jesus and the apostles. And so we have a woman pouring water, and we have a man, Bartholomew. And Doug describes him as transfixed by the woman and the water being poured. And he looks very much like the Bartholomew that Da Vinci painted. But in this case, he's just transfixed. And here she is. This is the woman that's pouring the water. And it's notable, in my opinion anyway, that there are no women in Da Vinci's painting. They're all men. But Doug balanced the thing. And to me, this is the Aquarian imago. Here she is, pouring water from one cask to another. And this, as you know, or have probably heard, we are now in the very beginnings of the age of Aquarius. And I will talk a little bit more about it. And here is the water being poured from one cask to another. And if you understand the symbolism for water, this would correspond with the unconscious. So here is somebody, a human being, both Bartholomew and the woman, looking at the water and implying that there is a consciousness to be distilled in which you can understand the unconscious. Doug, when he looked at this, now remember, this is the reciprocity, the dynamic reciprocity. Doug looked at it and saw a bowl, 4 plates, and another bowl. And in Doug's mind, that constitutes a hexagram. And it is the hexagram of preponderance of the great. To me, that is a remarkable understanding, because preponderance of the great means something is unsustainable, that the ridgepole is sagging and action needs to be taken, but most likely gentle action, not great action. So with that, let's look at the age of Pisces, the one we just left in our lifetime. Here is the Holy Grail. Here are the 12 mugs, cups, and here's the Holy Grail. But Bartholomew here in Doug's painting is much more interested in the water being poured and the woman pouring the water than the Grail cup and all the cups for the apostles. Doug has a wry sense of humor. And he said, Bob, I had to paint that background myself. He said, Da Vinci didn't do it because Jesus was in the way. I like that very much. Jesus getting in the way. Yeah. So, this is, in my opinion, an excellent example of the dynamic of reciprocity and creativity. Okay. Jung says, one certainly has an understandable desire for unambiguous clarity, but we are apt to forget that matters of the soul are processes of experience, that is, transformations, which should not be unequivocally designated if one does not wish to petrify the living moment into static. So there's got to be some breathing room here with regard to unambiguous clarity. Now let's go back to my favorite quote in this lecture. Let's have some fun with this. In Buddhism, this return to nirvana is connected with a complete extinction of the ego, which, like the world, is only illusion. In Taoism, on the other hand, the goal is to preserve in transfigured form the idea of the person, the traces left behind by experience. That is the light which with life returns to itself and which is symbolized in the golden flower. I want to emphasize here traces. So what I would like you to do, if you would, is get comfortable. Okay? Yeah. Get comfortable. Close your eyes. And let's explore traces together. What would be your traces? Things loved? Memories? Essential turning points in life? Beauty? Acts of personal courage? Would that be a trace for you? Or would a trace be perhaps the smell of pine trees? Friends, perhaps, would constitute traces. Or maybe critical dreams that you've had constitute traces. So let's shift now to my myth. And I'd like to talk about that by what it isn't to start. And then we'll talk about what it is. For me, I have rejected the idea of heaven and hell and an afterlife. I'm just saying this is my myth. I'm not saying anybody else's myth is wrong. I'm not doing the judgment paradigm. But for me, the concept of heaven and hell and an afterlife is fundamentally a judgment paradigm, and I'm not exactly sure what the terms are for admission to heaven as far as the judgment paradigm goes. So, to me, it doesn't get traction. Another thing I reject, and again, this is my myth. This is how I'm thinking about it. I reject suffering as a badge of courage. Some people wear it proudly as a badge of courage and tell you how they suffer. But to me, that's not what suffering is about. Nor is it a kind of perverse currency for admission to heaven. I know I'm going to heaven because I suffered. Well, for me, there's a little too much martyrdom in these ideas to suit me personally. Incidentally, I gave this talk about 30 years ago to the Jung Society, back when speakers were featured at the old Walter Reed Hospital auditorium. And I talked about the role of suffering in a person's life, as well as the function of shame, which I don't feel Jung investigated sufficiently for the power that it holds for people in life, my opinion, again. So, I'm much more inclined to embrace Viktor Frankl's notion. He says, each person's suffering is unique. Her opportunity for growth lies in the way he or she bears it. That's not always the case. Jim Hollis and I talked about it. That's not always the case with suffering. But in some situations, it can really be an opportunity for growth. Not all, though, but some. So let me talk about now my myth for dying. I see death as a process of personal transformation. And it's a process that allows us to sustain our spirit into our own death in the face of our physical diminution. I also embrace the incorporation of the Tao perspective on consciousness after death. That is, the idea of a transfigured form. That transfigured form, I obviously have no idea what it would be, but I embrace the idea that it is possible to exist in a transfigured form. And I also embrace Jung's idea that consciousness continues after death, and that the meaning of our life is central, if I understand him correctly from the quote, that the meaning you've derived from your life is a central consideration in the distillation of our life allegorically. Now, let's move on to the third part of my talk tonight. I would like to talk about negative capability. And I'd like to revisit the definition of negative capability, according to Keats, is when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, in mysteries, with doubts, but without any irritable reaching for fact and reason. Kind of a restatement of Jung's idea, which I embrace. You got to have some latitude. You just can't reduce it to Newtonian cause and effect. You can't lock it up. It's got to have some room to move, to breathe. Okay. So with that in mind, I've got a query. As I was thinking this talk through, I thought about love. And I thought about, where does love fit in a myth for dying? And I didn't have a ready answer. So I'll share with you how far I got in my thinking. And then you can pick it up and carry it forward any way you want to. So, in my clinical work, I have come to see love and abandonment as opposites. I don't see love and hate as opposites. I see love and abandonment are the quintessential feeling experiences of life. The enhancer or the knee buckler. But they are, from my perspective, the essential emotions in living. And to that end, and I won't go down this road with you, but to that end, to the end of talking about abandonment, I think of Jesus on the cross stating, "Father, why have you forsook me?" I think there's a great deal to be talked about in that consideration, but I just want to offer it as a powerful emotion that even Christ experienced. So let's go back to love. Okay? That's a better one to focus on. So I got to thinking, in Greek, there are 3, maybe 4 definitions of love. The one is eros, which is romantic love, erotic love, romantic love. The second is philia. That's brotherly love. And Philadelphia obviously has its name in brotherly love. The last one, I don't know how to pronounce it. I learned it agape, but some people say agape. And this is selfless love. So I got to thinking about selfless love with my negative capability concept. Selfless love. So what you see here is a photograph taken of Jung in his office as he appeared in 1957. And this is from the book The House of C.G. Jung, pages 82 and 83. But I have just been so drawn to this picture, and I don't quite know why, but I've got an inkling. Incidentally, this photograph was taken by Tim Gadal, currently is in the collection of the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. It hangs there in a museum. Looking at this picture, I was deeply struck by its beauty and potential allegory. On the tapestry, we are looking at the Bodhisattva, Samantabhadra. I'm fascinated by the Buddhist notion of a Bodhisattva as an expression of incredible love. Imagine achieving enlightenment and becoming released from the wheel of samsara. No more pain, no more suffering, no more abandonment. Despite his release as an enlightened being, the Bodhisattva chooses to return to help all others find a path of liberation out of samsara for all sufferers. I think this is a most remarkable concept of love. Upon release, to choose to return to help others. A little deeper, the Bodhisattva that hung in Jung's office that we're looking at right now was that of Samantabhadra, or universal worthy. He is referred to as Canon in Zen Buddhism. He, along with two other Bodhisattvas, formed the Shakyamuni triad. He is credited with creating the 10 vows of a Bodhisattva. In Tibetan Buddhism, Samantabhadra is often portrayed with his consort, Samantabhadri, and they exist in an invisible union known as the Yab-Yum. I am of the opinion that Jung was indeed a Bodhisattva. The doors are now wide open for all of us, modern alchemists, centroverts, all of us. The doors are wide open now to find the hidden meaning in our lives. Thanks to Sege Jung. Looking at this picture, Jung studiously reading while Samantabhadra hangs in the room suggests to me a reciprocal allegory, one that is filled with negative capability. He hung that in his office. That was for him to look at and be informed by. And now we're looking at it. And we're looking at it in a way that has negative capability. The truth of my own personal opinion allows me to feel like Doug's Bartholomew. Bartholomew was transfixed, looking at the woman in the water. Just as I have been transfixed by this photograph taken in 1957. Jung as a bodhisattva may seem very far-fetched to the madding crowd, But for me, it makes incredible sense that Jung was a bodhisattva and his life a profound offering of love. Thank you. Thank you very much. Woo! Now we can have